All right. Hello, and welcome to today's Digital BC live stream. My name is Jordan Samus. I'm the Executive Director of AI Adoption in the Office of the Chief Information Officer in Ministry of Citizen Services. We're a new branch that has recently stood up, and we're working to support the thoughtful use of artificial intelligence in the public services. This live stream series is a chance for us as a public service to hear from thought leaders working in the intersection of technology, policy, and public interest, and help us think more deeply about the work that we're engaging in. Before we kind of get into I introduce our guest today and dive into the conversation, I just wanted to acknowledge that I'm joining you today from the traditional territories of the Lekwungen people, known today as the Esquimalt and Songhees nations, whose relationships with this land continue to this day. So I'm pleased to welcome, when she gets back, Professor Dr. Aimee van Wynsberghe. She's a global leader in AI ethics and the founder of the Bonn Sustainable AI Lab. She is an Alexander von Humboldt Professor of Applied Ethics of Artificial Intelligence and Director of the Institute of Science and Ethics at the University of Bonn in Germany. Professor Dr. van Wynsberghe's work is especially relevant for us in the public service as we consider how AI may shape or reshape or intersect how we deliver services, allocate our people and resources, and build trust with the public and our public service.
Hi, can you see me? Can you hear me?
There we are.
Okay, good. Sorry, I keep getting kicked out of the room, so I'll try. I'll just hang on.
Okay. All good. Appreciate that, Aimee. So I just completed your introduction and kind of where you work and the work that you do with the Bonn Sustainable AI Lab. So welcome, Aimee. Appreciate you having us for as long as we have you until hopefully we don't get kicked out.
No, thank you. Thank you so much for the invitation. It's really wonderful to be here for as long as I'm here.
There we go. Well, we roll with that. So we have a couple questions that we developed in advance, and we'll go through those in a minute, and then we'll have a section for questions and answers later. So just encouraging, again, folks to submit your questions. Submit your questions in advance and then upvote the ones you would like us to try to tackle. So let's jump into a few of the questions we have off the bat. So Aimee, sustainable AI is a concept you've helped shape and define that goes beyond traditional AI ethics. Can you describe what sustainable AI means and why it's important?
Sure, I can. And to do this, it's a bit of a longer answer because I'd like to
Yeah.
describe sort of the shifts within the field of AI ethics. So, in the same way that we can talk about a technological evolution when we're talking about artificial intelligence, we can do the same with AI ethics. So, with AI as a technology, we've seen this, expansion or development from good old-fashioned AI towards machine learning, towards generative AI. So, we can isolate or identify trends in the technological space. And the same thing goes for AI ethics. So, the way that I describe these waves or trends in AI ethics is that I talk about the first wave of AI ethics. And this is really focused on sort of super intelligence, the singularity. So a technology that actually hasn't been realized today, and also a focus on these kind of dystopian scenarios. So, the Terminator scenario, AI is going to rise up and end mankind or humankind, sorry. So really a discussion about a technology that doesn't exist with a very negative impact on the technology. And then in response to this, AI ethicists sort of switched into a more practical look at the real world ethical implications. So the AI that's actually being used in society today. So this second wave of AI ethics is a principlist approach, looking at different applications, different contexts, and particular models or ways of developing AI. So like machine learning, for example, discussing the black box, right?
Yep.
It's so different from good old-fashioned AI in that we don't always know the rules that are created, generated, or we don't even understand them. When I say we, I mean the tech developers. And so this is also, issues like AI in the judicial system for prediction of recidivism, predictive policing, AI in healthcare. So the ethicists were looking at real world applications and focused on issues like biases in the training
Hmm.
data, how these are exacerbated then with the outputs generated by AI, fairness, data collection, the black box, as I mentioned before. So these are the more canonical AI ethics issues that people might be more familiar with.
Yeah.
And then, in response to this second wave, what I've been trying to push forward or to encourage us to think about is a more structural approach. So, thinking not just about AI applications, using AI in the healthcare domain, not just methods of training, so good old-fashioned AI versus machine learning versus generative AI, but understanding AI as an infrastructure, right? It's not just
Hmm.
one model anymore, right? AI is revolutionizing the public, the private sector, and we're talking about data centers across the globe, the usage of water, right? This is more than just training one algorithm. So within this idea of AI as infrastructure, and I refer to it as the structural approach, this is where sustainable AI fits in. And so sustainable AI, as I define it, is looking at two branches, AI for sustainability and the sustainability of AI. And AI for sustainability, there's a lot of research in this area, a lot of funding in this area. And this is the idea of using AI to achieve the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals, using AI to address the climate crisis and look at how we can mitigate different aspects of the climate crisis. So, really wonderful initiatives, wonderful goals. But the question remains, does it make sense to use an unsustainable technology for sustainable ends? And
Hmm.
this is where that other branch comes in, that really I'm also trying to look at the sustainability of AI. And this is where we have to look at all different kinds of environmental factors like energy consumption, the associated carbon emissions, the water usage that's necessary to cool the data centers, the mining of precious minerals, right? Because this physical infrastructure, it's not just AI running on the cloud. There's a massive physical infrastructure, and the
Yeah.
planet is involved in this. So, wrapping it up, sustainable AI is looking at these two branches, how we can bring them together, and how we can really look at this structure of the planet, of the globe that's involved in the making of this AI infrastructure.
Awesome. Thank you. I really like the way you kind of brought clarity to those two pillars, and because I often see even in my own experience the tensions between them, and how do we do one without the other, and it's something I think that's a lot of minds and a lot of hearts of people in British Columbia too, because we
Yeah.
have a very strong ethic around protecting our environment, and we also have a lot of we're kind of rich within a lot of natural resources, and it's a big part of our way of life and economy, and so there's lots of intersections there. So appreciate that. Um, Next question for you. You've helped shape AI ethics policies in Europe and internationally. What do you think some of the significant ethical challenges governments are facing when deploying AI responsibly, and how can we address them? And that it also can be specific to sustainable AI within that.
Okay. So I think to answer this question, this is also a really broad question. I would
Hmm.
start with talking about just some sort of challenges in general. So not necessarily like what ethics challenges, but kind of challenges to the incorporation of ethics into policy,
Hmm.
regulation, or governance. And the first one has to do with attitudes. And when I was thinking about, how I would answer this question, I thought, it's attitudes of the public. But then when I was doing some more reading, I thought, actually, it's attitudes of policymakers and of big tech. And what I mean by this is there's some common slogans that are being thrown around that ethics, governance, regulation stifles innovation, right? So the idea that if you have to slow down, if you have to pay attention to fundamental human rights, you are going to stifle innovation. That's sort of the
Yeah.
baseline thinking. And when I think about this, of course we want to innovate and to see if we can help mitigate the climate crisis as fast as possible. But at the same time, we want to do this with certain guardrails in place. So
Yeah.
an interesting analogy that one can think about is the idea of seatbelts. And so when seatbelts were first introduced in the 50s, people were like, oh, no, it was going to be uncomfortable. It was going to be way too expensive. The cultural aspect is going to take away my freedom. So many things to consider and whether or not it's actually effective. Yeah. And then in the 60s and 70s, this is where public opinion started to change because there was all of these safety campaigns. And now we're at a situation where the idea of getting into a car without a seatbelt seems preposterous. And so
Hmm.
when I think of regulation, governance, ethics, and AI, I think of the seatbelt. Of course, let's innovate. Of course, let's see how fast we can go, but let's have safety belts. Let's have guardrails in place in order to do this innovation. So I would say the first thing that governments are up against is really this public attitude, but also the attitude of big tech. And then the question is, what can they actually do about it? I think policymakers are also confronted with this how to balance between ethics and economics. And
Hmm.
so, in the European Union, in October, I'll be in Brussels to have a discussion about the possibility of an AI and sustainability coalition between different EU member states. And so, a lot of these conversations have to do with, of course, we want to be on the side of ethics. We want to do good. We want to protect the environment. Can we also, as a way of encouraging member states, can we also show that this is economically feasible and desirable and beneficial? Right? So, how do policymakers make this balance between wanting to do the right thing and also, understanding the realities of the situation? That's definitely something to be considered. And then alongside that is sort of the speed, right? So again, going into this move fast, break things mentality, regulation is notoriously, or I mean, just the reality is it's not at the same speed of tech development.
Right.
And how do you balance that? And I think an interesting thing for the public to consider, as well as policymakers, is that any new technology that's introduced into society is kind of done so as a social experiment. And so when we think about AI being used in society today, we are all a part of this massive social experiment. And I don't mean to scare anyone, but I mean to think about the reality of that, right? We don't know where AI is going. Generative AI kind of, exploded and our minds were sort of blown by that. So we are all in the middle of this experiment. What kind of policies and regulations can we create to allow the experiment to unfold, but again, with those guardrails in place that we don't step over fundamental rights and protections for the average individual. The last thing that I wanted to say was in terms of regulation, what policymakers should be thinking about is the what do they regulate and who needs to be regulated. And
Mm.
so, to sort of make this clear in terms of what needs to be regulated, of course, in the EU, the idea is we're regulating data provenance. How is data collected? How is it, how do we keep track of the entire life cycle of data to ensure sort of a lack of biases and protection of or promotion of fairness? And so this is sort of the thinking behind the EU AI Act. And what's interesting though is that the global north, North America in particular, is way ahead of the global south. So when we're talking about regulation, it's kind of like reining in what they've already been able to do. And this is in terms of data collection and just sort of the amount of data that we have over in North America or the global north and computing infrastructure. And when you look at other countries like the global south, they're, 10 steps behind. And so when we're talking about, who needs to be regulated, is it fair that we're regulating on this level playing field when we are 10 steps ahead? Yeah. And so this isn't something that I have an easy answer to, just something to sort of consider. And does the global north owe something to the global south because they've had this head start, if you will? And then also looking at the what needs to be regulated. So the who and the what. Um, this is also, so I talked about the EU AI Act having a focus on sort of data provenance, on the model training and looking at, the different sort of methods of training, Go5 versus machine learning versus generative AI. And then, really, we're at a kind of phase in this social experiment where we're still uncovering and learning about the different methodologies, and then how do we regulate them? Yeah, so right now we're in the tracking. How do we collect the data that's necessary in order to understand what kind of limitations we should put on it? Um, But in terms of environmental considerations, this is something that I would say we are still lacking, that we need regulation. So I would be there to promote and encourage policymakers to be thinking about this as the what should they regulate, and again to think of this idea of phases. So while I mentioned energy consumption, associated carbon emissions, and whatnot, we still don't know how bad the problem is. So there's no requirement in terms of transparency for big tech or for public sectors for that matter to provide how much, whether or not they're using renewable energy sources, how much energy is used, what are the associated carbon emissions, how much water is being used to cool the data centers, and on, where the minerals are actually coming from, what kind of electronic waste are they producing when the data centers or when the GPUs are being upgraded. So I would say we need an environmental impact assessment as stage one, and then we need to be able to move on to what kind of limitations do we want to put in place. And as I mentioned before, the EU is, this meeting is happening in October in Brussels to talk about a coalition for sustainable AI. In Germany, where I live, the Federal Ministry for Nature Conservation, Nuclear Safety, and Consumer Protection, they formed an expert group. I'm on this expert group, and this group is meant to talk about sustainable AI and how can we bring our knowledge to the ministers, and hopefully Germany will create some sort of guidelines for sustainable AI. And in the United States in 2024, certain politicians were advocating for the United States AI Environmental Impact Act. This wasn't ratified or passed, but at least it was, on the table. And the idea, again, was to look at how we can record or measure the environmental impact of AI development, deployment, and disposal. So the entire life cycle of AI. And then with this knowledge, with this understanding, the next step is to look at what kind of limitations we should put in place, again, to sort of coming back to this, two pillars to recognize the fact that in order to even talk about using AI to address sustainability goals, we have to assess the sustainability of AI.
Exactly. I think that fantastic answer, Aimee, and I appreciate all the dimensions you brought forward there. It's one of the things that I'm seeing or looking across to is just how varied some of the regulatory landscape looks like, and how some folks are very deregulation and some folks are very regulation. And then I appreciate the layer you added there around some of the myths that might be assumed with those that are pursuing regulation. And I'm kind of reflecting a little bit too, just even in my time in public sector, of just the challenge. You mentioned the challenge of speed earlier in your answer, and the AI feels like it's just another whole nother dimension around the speed of the technology advances, and given that it's like designed to self-perpetuate the speed, the exponential growth of it. And so I think that's going to be quite an interesting. We'll see. It'll be quite interesting to see how our public sector, like globally, responds to that and rides that wave.
Yeah. And whether or not we can have global policy or governance. I think with ethics, we've seen how difficult that is because there are different ethical traditions depending on, which continent you're talking about. But I do think with sustainable AI, there is hope because the planet, the globe, essentially, we're all in the same boat when it comes to the climate crisis. And so ideally, we could look at some kind of global governance framework in terms of environmental protection when it comes to this technology or innovation in particular.
Awesome. We had a third prepare question, but I'm hearing that we got a lot of questions in our chat, and I'm not surprised. And it's a reason why we wanted to start having this conversation, just because our third question was around kind of building trust. But I think it's a good kind of segue into us building trust within our public service, about having kind of open conversations about these tough things. And many of them we don't have answers for right now, and we're in a kind of a learning and wayfinding kind of space. So I'm going to turn it over just in respecting our audience and their engagement. I'm going to turn it over to our first question we had from our audience, and we'll try to tackle as many of those as we can. So we had a first question around And I'd be interested in your experience in this, Aimee, in the sense that you are working in the European Union. There's many different countries, many different cultures, and then you're also engaging with a whole bunch of other, you mentioned the global north, the global south, those different dimensions. And so, can you talk a little bit about how ethics of AI may change based on where AI is being implemented in the world? So different cultures, different legal systems, different countries, what might be considered ethical in country A might not be considered ethical in country B. And I'm also just mindful of, I think, your conversation about the power or the disparity between the North and the South globally, and how like different histories also very much come into play of how those came about.
Okay. Yeah, great question. I'll try and keep my answers as short as possible so that we can get through as
Sure.
many questions as we can. But that means that I will keep it on the surface. And so there's
Sure.
much more to say. I can talk about an hour probably for all of the questions. Okay,
Yeah.
so in terms of different ethical approaches, I think what's important to acknowledge is that the conversation in the AI ethics space right now, we're seeing some pushback on what's been happening in the first and the second wave of AI ethics. So some ethicists
Mm,
are talking about an epistemic gap, that all of the ethics, there's hundreds of ethics principles that have been created in the public sector, in the private sector, by civil society organizations, looking at privacy, fairness, on and on and on. And now researchers are saying there's an epistemic gap, that all of these ethics principles come from Eurocentric ethical frameworks.
mm,
So Kantian approaches, Aristotelian approaches,
mhm.
these ethical traditions that have been around for hundreds of years in Europe and in North America. And what about other non-European ethical traditions? So we can think about Indigenous perspectives. And so in Canada, I love
Yeah.
the way that you do the land appreciation at the beginning of every talk, of every presentation. And what can we learn from Indigenous
Mhm.
communities when it comes to the development of artificial intelligence? So there's a whole area known as Indigenous AI, and there's two different branches that you can talk about here. It's using AI to promote preservation and protection of Indigenous values. Alternatively, what can we learn from the Indigenous values frameworks in terms of the
Yep.
development and the deployment and the disposal of AI? So there's the two dimensions there as well. Other Indigenous perspectives. I work with the University of Ghana, with the philosophy department there. And so I have students coming to spend a year at a time with me in my research team, and we are learning about Ubuntu philosophy. And within the Ubuntu tradition, this is a sub-Saharan African ethical tradition. It's not the only one, but it's the most predominant one. The emphasis within Ubuntu is on community and environmental stewardship. And when I say the emphasis on community, in contrast to the European human rights centered perspective, if it's good for me, then okay, we can talk about if it's good for everyone else. Ubuntu says, I am because we are.
Yeah.
Yeah, so I am only a person with moral standing, with moral value, because I am a part of this community. If the community is flourishing, I am flourishing. And so, what would an ethics framework to stimulate and to
Yeah.
inspire policy look like if it wasn't about me as the individual and how to protect me, but how do you protect the community and the ecosystem within which the community lives? And so, I've been working with different scholars from the University of Ghana to write papers on what policy in Africa would look like if Ubuntu was the ethical tradition at the foundation, the normative grounding for such a policy.
Right.
And to be sure, many countries on the continent of Africa are developing their own AI ethics strategies and policies. They mention Ubuntu, but they don't actually bring the values into their strategies. They're still really relying on, the EU AI Act. And so this is kind of like an appropriation, almost a colonizing, a sort of
Mm.
colonizing impact. And so
Yeah.
there's scholars though that are looking at how can we break free from this sort of history of colonization. And that's another field, decolonizing AI, queer AI, feminist AI. There are so many different branches in the AI and ethics space.
Awesome. I feel like I want to, if I wasn't worried about the emissions, I would want to jump on a plane and come over to Bonn and join you in your school because I think I feel like everyone, and I'd imagine many of our audience members wants to dive into these things. But it's a great um, I think it's a great lead into many different areas around the intersection of thought and AI, and philosophy and AI, and many different dimensions to think about, and how diverse that is, and especially in a place like BC with a lot of diversity. I think it's just something we need to continue to engage in and think about. I'm going to switch a little bit more to kind of a big tech question. And so a second question we had was, do you see any, from your experience, do you see any ethical alternatives to big players, such as OpenAI, Microsoft, or we're a Microsoft enterprise ourselves, Amazon, Anthropic, Meta's Llama, Alphabet, DeepMind, those type of things? And I think the question is also basically saying, because if not, can any use of AI be considered ethical? So I guess there's a presupposing that use of those things would not be ethical.
Ooh, good one. Okay, so I would say yeah, this is a really tough question, and I need to answer it carefully. So, in terms of ethical alternatives to the big tech players, of course, you have open source alternatives. We're learning about DeepSeek, and it's not as effective as we might originally have thought, because there are certain gaps in the
Yep.
information that's provided, if you will. So, there's pros and cons to sort of everything, but I would say open source is a first step. But the problem with this, are there ethical alternatives? Big tech has so much money, and they've built such a massive infrastructure when it comes to their computing power, the data that they have. The public sector can't compete. I try and do research and to run experiments in my lab as a humanities scholar, but I have my own, computing infrastructure, and yet I can't compete. There's no way. So I think what needs to happen is, some sort of bridging between private and public, that there needs to be some kind of reciprocity. Can we provide some of the infrastructure to the public sector? Because the big tech is relying on public infrastructure, and so why not have some sort of sharing or reciprocity between the two? That's a bit of a tangent. So in terms of alternatives that can match that level, unfortunately, there's nothing at that level. Hugging Face is the one that comes close in terms of open source. Then the second part of the question, right, is it ethical at all to use any of these AI? So it depends on how you define, is it ethical? This isn't an easy calibration, right? The sort of proportionality is really difficult. Like, what do we consider ethical? So if we're using a GPT or any kind of LLM for cheating on an exam or writing my essays for me, or, I have students who I don't know if they're using GPT to do their final essay for me, which means I've changed my teaching style, that they have to talk to me in class because I can't rely on the final essay. So I would say that's unethical, but it doesn't have anything to do with sort of the fact that they're using tech from big tech. Yeah. However, if we're talking about using AI, and we're talking about in the healthcare space, right? Like DeepMind shared a Nobel Prize last year when we were talking about AlphaFold, and the ability to sort of predict or to make predictions about targeted pharmaceutical drug applications. Yes, they're using the big tech infrastructure, so that part is unethical, but we're talking about the possibility to save lives with the use of this AI. So I give these two sides of the coin to show how difficult it is to say whether it's ethical or not, good or bad, to use these large infrastructures. It's really a nuance, and you have to go through what makes it ethical. Is it the usage, or is it the use of the infrastructure? So I know that I evaded the question, but I wanted to do that to show how difficult it is.
Yeah, and I think, like, for one of the things for me is it ties back to some of your commentary around, like, that second wave around, like, looking at, like, really the practical on the ground things, and that those things are complex and those things are nuanced, and it's not just a theoretical exercise. It is, I have, as you said, like with the healthcare example, in like, this is not good, but this is good, and how do I square these up? And I think I think we're going to run into a lot of those situations, and we'll have to wrestle with those as a society as we go forward for sure.
Yeah,
One
definitely.
other kind of thing that I've also just been seeing a little bit is I think there's that kind of dimension of public and private, but I'm also seeing, and you mentioned about the connections with infrastructure and kind of like who has infrastructure, who doesn't. But also seeing that kind of debate unfold from like more of a national sovereignty perspective, in the sense
Mhm.
of like, does that infrastructure exist in what country? And with global dynamics right now, that's also like seems like another element. I'm not saying we need to go into that topic, but I'm just saying there's another layer to this too that I'm seeing, or many folks are seeing.
Mhm.
We'll jump on to our next question. I'm not sure they get less easy,
Ah,
but we knew what we were signing up for. So the third question was, how do ethicists approach the claims that many functions currently performed by humans will be made redundant or being able to be performed by AI?
Right. Yeah, I hear this a lot that AI is going
Yeah.
to replace our jobs. And so, be scared. There was even a time, I mean, it was more related to robots, but I remember there was a time where you could go to like the BBC website, type in your job, and it would give you the percentage of likelihood that your job would be replaced by a robot or AI. So I understand this is a recurring trope, if you will. I think so. The first reports that came out, talked about how many jobs were going to be replaced. But then again, this idea of as we experience the technology more, our understanding of it enhances. We have a broader sort of perspective from the ethics dimension. When you think about a job, it's not just one task. Most of the time, you have bundles of tasks that you do. And so when we're talking about AI, we don't have general AI that can do, talk to your coworkers about we need to work on your soft skills, yeah, and then turn over and needs to write a protocol in the meeting that they just had, and then turn to discuss something else with a different set of coworkers, right? So we can have AI to help with certain bundles or to help with certain tasks. AI is great at sort of synthesizing what happened in a meeting and turning that into a protocol. Do we want AI, LLMs or whatever, to talk to employees about learning soft skills? Yeah, can it do all of these different tasks? So I'm not too worried about AI completely wiping out certain professions or certain
Yeah.
jobs, but I do think it will be used to sort of augment someone in their role and to be an assistant, literally an assistant. And then we also talk about, we've seen with all different kinds of innovations how different jobs are created. Yeah. So certain
Yep.
jobs, like when the computer came along, right? Uh,
Yep.
we moved from handwritten or the shift from the typewriter to the computer and whatnot for calculations and things like that. Yeah, different jobs are created. I think what's important to consider is what kind of jobs are being created and who those jobs will be accessible for. And
Yep.
so many people are being encouraged to study STEM, science, technology, engineering, and mathematics. And so for me, what comes to my brain and what sort of, has a little trigger or red light warning is who is studying STEM subjects right now. And we see predominantly it's more males versus females. Apologies for using a binary distinction, but the
Mhm.
research addresses it in this way. And so, I mean, in the UK, there was this campaign that it was only 11% of females were or sort of the total of students, 11% was females in the STEM categories or studies. So I think what's important to think about is new jobs are going to be created and who's being trained to go into these new jobs and how can we have a different kind of balance through mentoring and through encouraging
Yep.
also women to study these jobs. But no, I wouldn't be worried that your job is going to be completely wiped out, but we do need to think about how we're going to integrate AI into the workspace.
That's a good point. I think I would share that opinion that there's a lot of um, human work and human heart. I think work that is needed, especially in a public service as well, and that AI can generally help augment and support folks in a lot of different ways. And
Yeah.
it's a good point around that how this happens. Are the benefits or the impacts of those how are those not exacerbating existing inequalities or creating new ones? So
Yeah.
it's a good.
Yeah.
All right. Fourth question, and I think this probably will be our last question. Well, we'll see what timing, how we unfold here. But I'm going to jump to one, just so we make sure we get it in. So, Dr. Aimee, apologies for potentially too broad of a question, but if you have any advice for hopeful public servants looking to navigate our mandate, our work amongst the rapid changes of AI technologies. I might have read that was a little bit of the wrong inflection, but basically, I think it's like, do you have any advice for public servants that are kind of wrestling with these things as part of their work? And I think, we have a lot of public servants that actively choose to be public servants. They are called to a mission, they're a specific one, or just generally in serving the public interest, and sometimes are concerned about some of the topics we've been talking about.
And so, do I understand the question correctly? As a public servant, how do I handle the introduction of AI into my job?
I think it was just any advice you have for a hopeful public servant looking to navigate this work.
Yeah.
So,
Okay.
and maybe that's pulling in some of the commentary around the balancing of regulation and doing the work in a safe, responsible way with kind of pushes to delivery, those type of things.
Yeah, yeah. I would say so. I'm answering these as an academic, but I would say do some research into AI. So and into AI ethics. So it's one thing to learn about the technology and how it works, and what I just mentioned. There's been these different stages of technological development, from good old-fashioned AI to machine learning to generative AI, but also look at how we understand AI in a social context. So we have something called social technical systems. Yeah, and this is the sort of reciprocal relationship between technology development and society, that we are not just consumers, we are simultaneously shaping the development of the technology. So to explore concepts like that, so that you also feel empowered. Yeah, we're not just these passive, as public servants, they can't just throw a technology on you and you sort of have to suck it up and use it. We should be empowered knowing that we are actually co-creating this technology. And then also to be skeptical, right? So this idea that I mentioned, AI as a social experiment, we should be skeptical of the technology and question it, and question how we're being told to use it, and question the impact that it's going to have. And to be able to question these things, we have to have more knowledge, have more understanding of it. So I would say to look into resources in terms of AI ethics, in terms of critical theory. And there's a lot out there. There's a lot to read, and to do this kind of, looking at the broader picture. So this is what we would refer to in terms of AI literacy. And then I would also say the question of democratizing AI is very, very important. And as a public servant, you are in a really unique position that you are looking at it from this space, and you might be able to make change in whatever space you're working with, to say, listen, let's have a town hall meeting, maybe for your fellow colleagues. We need to talk about this new technology that's come in, not just how it works. Yes, you've shown us how it works, but we need to talk about our anxieties, our fears, and what we see as being really promising. So what I do with my staff is we launched a platform called which has which has GPT, and all of the different versions, 4.0. Lambda, whatnot, Dolly. And we said, okay, we're going to test it out for 2 months. Then we have a meeting with the team. What's working? What isn't working? How would we define the responsible use of the technology? And so we created our own guidelines for responsible use of different LLMs or AI in general. So as a public servant, why not, pitch that idea? What can we do in this space? And then also, so that's a town hall for your fellow co-workers, but then also pitching to whoever will listen to you, town hall meetings for the municipalities or communities that you're working for. I'm also a public servant, so I hear you. I understand. Do we have a different kind of responsibility because we're not in the private sector? And yeah, actually we do. And then it's looking for ways to be inventive.
Yeah, and I think that healthy critique and skepticism is something like it's a part of our responsibility as public servants to do. And then in the pursuit of in some of your work earlier around like how might we be able to use AI for good in that work.
Yeah, definitely.
And so
To find that balance.
And I like your thought too around that. I think there's AI literacy is a balance between kind of what like we as an organization can help drive forward, but also that our personal interests we can pursue a lot. Many of these things are available to us right now on many different dimensions.
Yeah,
And it's good for
definitely.
us to build that skill and to build that knowledge base.
Yeah. And then I would emphasize the taking action part that I
Mm.
think, thinking of this responsibility as civil servants or public servants that we have, we do have a responsibility to take action when we're
Yeah,
seeing different things, whether it's within our community of coworkers or reaching beyond that. I think that's part of our mandate, if I might be so
totally.
bold.
Exactly. We have an oath to do good work.
Yes.
So, a last question, and probably just a quicker one, a response, and then we'll probably look to close out. I'm sure I know already there's many questions we were not able to get to, and appreciate that this is a start of a dialogue. And as you mentioned, Aimee, around like having town halls and having these types of conversations, I think this in and of itself is the start of that kind of dialogue to have around some of these issues. So the last question for today is, and I might add my spin to it, so apologies a little bit to the author. But so the question was, how can ethics guardrails be enforced in an environment where bodies like the UN are increasingly ignored or bypassed? And so I think for me, my kind of addition to is also that we're seeing a lot more seeing some skepticism around institutions in general, and their ability to be effective, especially in more like beyond a national level as well. So
Yeah. Yeah. Okay. So this is a difficult question to answer. So, the first way that I need to tackle this question is to point out the difference between the legal domain and the ethics domain.
mhm,
Laws can be enforced, and you have punishment isn't the right word, but something happens if you don't follow the law. Yeah, ethics is a different domain entirely. You don't force people to follow ethics guidelines, then it becomes a law. They need to be encouraged, and you act ethically based on the fact that you've been provided the reasons that encourage you, that motivate me to act in an ethical way. So this is an
mhm,
important distinction between ethics
yep,
and laws. Ethics needs to be voluntary. And this is where the UN sort of comes into play, and that it's a voluntary, also the Paris Agreement is a voluntary endeavor. And so you see big players stepping back or dropping out of these different institutions and organizations. So yeah, that's definitely unsatisfactory, but it is a reality when we're talking about the ethics domain. What I think, so then again, my area right now is focusing on this sustainability dimension and the
mhm,
environmental consequences. So I address that in terms of a global framework. I think that the sustainability, the environmental aspects is the most promising in terms of the ethics landscape for global cooperation, global governance schemes. When we talk about ethics, there are different traditions on the different continents. So you have a tradition like Ubuntu or East Asian ethical traditions. You have North American Eurocentric. So having a global ethics framework I see as being quite difficult, but looking at a global coalition for environmental protection when it comes to AI, that I see could be a possibility. And then for that, we need to begin with our understanding of the ethics, why this is ethically important, why we should be looking at the intrinsic value of nature. This is ecocentrism, intrinsic value of the globe, of the planet. Use that to create our regulations, our binding governance infrastructure. I hope that answered the question. I'm conscious of the time, so that's why I'm trying to
no,
pop
I,
up
th
with that.
appreciate that. And of course, I asked you a very difficult question with a 1 minute of time to answer. So,
Yeah.
but I think that's a great, it's a really useful way to kind of, I think sometimes we do bundle those things together, like ethics and legal. And I think it's a good reminder to separate those two things, and they have two different purposes and kind of enforceability upon them. So we're at time today. I really want to sincerely thank you, Aimee, for coming and sharing your thoughts and doing the work that you do. And I really want to thank our audience for joining today and for the thoughtful questions and the tremendous engagement. I think this is just, again, the start of a conversation that we'll need to keep going within the public service as we kind of wrestle with and tackle what AI means in the public service. Thanks for joining us, and goodbye for now.
Thank you.